Hello and welcome to this webinar delivered by the ISM Trust. I am Maria Visitiu and I'm Member Engagement and Events Officer at the ISM. And today I'm joined by statistician Alix Naylor, who will take us through the results of the ISM 2021 Teachers' Fee Survey. Before we begin, a few points. You should be able to see us and you should be able to hear us, but we can't see you or hear you. If you experience any technical difficulties, such as sound quality issues, please let us know in the chat box and we'll make attempts to resolve the issue. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. If you have any questions, please let us know in the questions box and we will make attempts to answer as many of them as possible at the end. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Alix for the presentation.
Hi, thanks for that intro, Maria, and nice to sort of virtually meet all of you that are here today. So as Maria said, I'm going to be talking you through the results of this year's ISM fees survey. So this was the first year that I ran this survey, so it was sort of new to me this year, and of course with the additional bits of trying to keep the survey the same as it had been in previous years, but also kind of taking into account this slightly odd year that we've had the past year, obviously with the pandemic, so lockdowns and non-lockdown, school being open and then not being open, and of course, you know, sometimes being able to teach in schools, sometimes teaching online. So we sort of tried to take all of these things into account, but without making the survey 10 times longer than it normally is. So one of the main differences this year was that rather than being open during the month of September at the start of the school year, the survey was run from early November till early January this year, to sort of try and capture as much of the school teaching as we could do. So by November, schools had been open for a couple of months, although again they have been then closed again from January. So hopefully we sort of got as much of a picture of how the situation was in schools that was possible to do, as well as capturing private teaching, which again changed across the year, depending whether we were in lockdowns, what kind of whether face-to-face meetings were allowed, how many people you could meet up with, and so on there. So we had the survey open to ISM members and non-members as well, so it was up on the website for those couple of months there. And so we asked people about private teaching in schools, either as employees or as self-employed visiting teachers. And we also asked about any accompanying work and examining work that had been done, but obviously, you know, with the situation over the last year, that was very different from normal years. I would imagine, in the sense of it was largely not possible to do this kind of work over the past year. And I say we also tried to get an idea of the impact that the pandemic and the lockdowns has had on people's teaching, people's fees, how people were teaching, but without asking sort of too many additional questions there. So we've got a kind of quite a good overview of how that went. And so sort of the main findings that we had was, the first one was that numbers were down on previous years in terms of just answering the survey itself. So it may be that this was because less people were teaching, so they didn't answer the survey. It may be because people did less teaching, so although people taught, they thought, well, I won't, you know, maybe I won't answer the survey this year because I've not done as much teaching. You know, it may be that people were furloughed. Obviously, school teachers may have been furloughed, so although they're still being employed, theoretically haven't done the teaching. So there's obviously many reasons why the numbers are going to be down, likely because of obviously the slightly unusual year we've had there. But we still did get a relatively decent sample size. We were able to do comparisons between regions, between different types of schools and those sorts of things, as have been done previously. And the good thing that was noted largely is that fees seem to have been kind of quite stable this year from previous years, and slightly increased in various areas as well. So although this has been a difficult year, and it looks like a lot of people, or a lot less people, have been able to do music teaching this year, those who have been able to teach do seem to have been able to kind of charge similar fees to what they've charged in previous years, and say maybe in some areas also increase. And we also saw a lot of success in some areas with online teaching. So across schools and private teaching, lots of teachers mentioned having done some forms of remote teaching. And although lots of people mentioned issues, connection issues, pupils not having access to broadband, some pupils didn't like online teaching, and all these sorts of things, there were quite a lot of positive comments from people saying that actually online teaching was good for them. Maybe they could reach more clients because you don't have to obviously be in the same town or city. They said that some pupils seem to actually enjoy online teaching more, whether that's maybe feeling less self-conscious or something, who knows. And also there were some comments about things like some pupils, school pupils, continuing lessons through the holidays where they normally wouldn't have been learning there. And there was also a suggestion that the private teachers seem to be getting a few more adult clients as well, whether that's maybe saying working from home, so having more spare time, maybe being furloughed, so having even more spare time, and maybe people having a bit more disposable income because there's nothing to spend it on because we couldn't do anything. So although online teaching has its challenges, it seems there were some positive aspects to being able to teach online there. But what was seen was that pupils in schools numbers did decrease, both for self-employed teachers and employed teachers, which is understandable because, of course, schools were closed for quite a long time anyway, and also groups had to be reduced. Face-to-face teaching was not allowed for quite some time. Various different types of teaching, so singing wasn't allowed for a while. I think in various areas, depending on Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, things like teaching woodwind and brass instruments wasn't allowed, but maybe teaching string instruments was, and things like that. So obviously we had lots of different varying rules across the year. So it's not surprising that we saw fewer pupils being taught in the schools. So the first thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is just a sample that we collected. So as you can see there, we collected a sample of 385 people who answered enough questions to sort of be included in the analysis. So quite a lot down on previous years, which is probably not unexpected because, as I say, there's bound to have been, I would imagine, a lot less people teaching because of the circumstances. But also you can see that a large proportion of the people that answered the survey are ISM members, so probably found the survey through the website, through the newsletters and things like that. So again, I've got a hypothesis. I mean, I don't know if this is the case, but it may well just be that we had teachers maybe this year who didn't renew their ISM membership for this year because they thought, well, I'm not going to be teaching much this year, or maybe weren't teaching at all, so thought, oh, well, I'll leave my membership until maybe later in the year when I start teaching again, because I don't think I'm going to need to use it this year. So it might just be that less people have seen the survey because of things like that as well. So it might not just be that people weren't teaching, it may be that more people just didn't see the survey as well. So that's that. But again, that's just my hypothesis. I've got lots of those from the data. And then, interesting, something's good. So you can see how I haven't done many Zoom presentations in the last year. I've done lots of Zoom sort of quizzes and calls and meetings, but not many presentations. And I was thinking, where's my second graph? But it's going to bring that up for me in a minute, so that's fine. That's good. And so another thing I've seen with the sample demographics is that the vast majority of the respondents have had more than 15 years of teaching experience. So if I just kind of highlight that on the table here, we've got 63% of the respondents have been teaching for more than 15 years. So, and another 24% have been teaching for more than 5 years. So another kind of hypothesis I was thinking is it may well be that we just have a kind of a large, or I want to say aging population of teachers, but not necessarily in a rude way when I say aging, but obviously people who've been teaching for a long time. So I think maybe people, newer teachers possibly were able to cope with the pandemic not as well because they didn't have such an established base of students. It may just be that where maybe schools were keeping on maybe one or two of their teachers, they went for the more experienced teachers, and the less experienced teachers were furloughed, let go, and things like that. So this is another thing I was thinking maybe a reason why the numbers are sort of starting to come down, because we saw this trend was actually seen last year as well, with lots of teachers with lots of experience. So it's one of those things that maybe teachers slowly are, going to be leaving the profession, and are younger teachers and newer teachers actually coming through, or is that maybe why samples are also reducing? as well. But again, it could be that there was more of an impact on the pandemic on younger teachers, less experienced teachers as well. But I say again, this is completely a hypothesis of mine. It may just be that younger people were less likely to answer the survey because actually newer teachers are more likely to be using the survey as an idea of, to give themselves an idea of what they might charge. There. And then the other thing that we saw was that most of the people answering the survey, so around 60% of the survey here, have either a bachelor's degree or higher, so some form of university qualification. And then where I've sort of grouped together other with all the other qualifications, there's various other qualifications people had, BTECs and MVQs and things like that. And the majority of the teachers that didn't have university qualifications did have something higher than A-level qualifications. So. Unfortunately, we didn't get very many responses at all from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which sort of put paid to sort of the hypotheses we were going to look at is whether teachers from the different devolved governments were maybe doing different types of teaching, less teaching, more teaching, different instruments and so on, based on the different kind of regulations that were coming out from the different governments across the lockdowns. But unfortunately, we had very few responses, say, from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So we haven't really been able to look in much detail at the differences between the four nations there, unfortunately. And also, as well as this, 40% of the sample are based either in London or the southeast of England. So this was a very similar proportion to what was seen last year. A vast or a large proportion of the sample are based in London and the southeast. So again, it's not clear whether that's because that's where more of the teaching work is, or whether more teachers from that area answered the survey. But it's an interesting to see such a large proportion based in that area. So it is something to be worth thinking about if you're based in Yorkshire, Wales, the southwest, any of those places. We do see that the fees tend to be higher in London and the southeast across schools, private teaching, and so on. So it is just worth bearing in mind that the fees that we're seeing in this survey are going to have been bumped up probably more than is representative of the whole country, because of the fact we've got such a large proportion from the higher fee regions. So that's just something to bear in mind there. So we were interested in looking at the different devolved nations before, because of those differing restrictions. We were sort of interested in knowing what people were teaching to kind of see whether in different areas people were finding it harder to teach, singing or woodwind or brass or so on and things like that. But unfortunately, as I say, because we had so few responses from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, we couldn't really go any further into that. But it was interesting when we looked at the what instruments people teach. So almost half of the teachers that responded teach piano or organ as their main instrument. But it's hard to know whether this is necessarily an accurate reflection of normal circumstances, because I'm going back really here. My memory of me learning instruments at school is that when I learned clarinet, and obviously people learn violins, flutes, these sorts of things. In my memory, a lot of the time you borrow the instrument from school, practice at home, which I'm assuming was probably not allowed during lockdowns and things to be borrowing instruments from schools, although of course I could be wrong there. So it may be that people actually were doing less lessons from home during lockdown because they just didn't have access to the instrument, whereas largely, I'm assuming mostly if people learn piano, they probably have a piano or a keyboard or something at home for practicing on. So it may just be that it was easier for piano teachers to do teaching during lockdown remotely and so on there. But I found it really interesting looking at the instrument question. It was something that was added in this year, but I think it's be quite an interesting one to look at going forward, just to kind of see the patterns of what is being taught, what's popular, especially in schools going forward. So probably look to keep that question going forwards. So the first subject that we asked people about was private teaching there. So we can see that the vast majority of the sample had done some form of private teaching. And so we asked, because of obviously the situation we had, we sort of asked about from March onwards. So obviously March is when we went into our first lockdown. So we sort of asked people about during the lockdown period, and we asked them about after the lockdown period, the first lockdown. period. And we asked about face-to-face and remote teaching. So we knew that from March to about August, July, August, remote teaching would have been the only way for people to be doing private lessons because we weren't allowed to meet up. And then from September onwards, we know that people would be allowed to do face-to-face teaching, but that some people might want to continue with remote lessons as well. So we sort of tried to encompass everything there. So unsurprisingly, we had quite a big drop in the number of people doing face-to-face lessons. So it was about 70% had done some form of face-to-face teaching since September, when since September, when kind of things started opening back up again. That's compared to about 90% last year, but it's not to be surprising because obviously for most of the year, people couldn't do face-to-face teaching. But we can see there that we've got hourly rates that are largely similar, whether people were doing remote teaching or face-to-face teaching. So that was a really positive thing to see, that people weren't having to sort of drop their fees to get people learning online, which was great to see. And we can see we have slight increases here in the rates from September 19 and 18 to this year. A couple of pounds, £1, £2 per hour, but it's good to see that those fees have been able to be increased for some people, despite the situation as well. So that was good to see, and especially as looking at the trend from September 18 to 19, there was very little increase. So it's that was good to see, and it was also very positive to see that people were able to charge the same rates or very similar rates for online teaching, which is great. And we did see regional differences, as I sort of mentioned at the start. We see regional differences between in fees across the UK. Say sample sizes in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland were very small, so we didn't do any comparisons between those. Or didn't compare those statistically to any of the other regions just because their numbers were too small. They are summarised in the main report, but the sample sizes were very small, so those figures would have to be taken very cautiously. But the fees in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland were coming out as very similar to the rest of the UK largely. So the only major difference is the southeast of England and London tend to be significantly higher in their rates. So they tend to charge between sort of £35 and £40 an hour, as opposed to the rest of the UK, which tends to be around the £30 to £35 mark. So that's just something to really be aware of, depending obviously where you're teaching. And of course, as I also mentioned previously, the fact that such a large proportion of the sample is from London. So these scores that we're seeing here for the whole sample, the median rates and the top and bottom rates, are going to have been probably pushed up quite a bit by that large London sample. And so if I just go on to the next slides here, as we see here, not only were the rates themselves kind of quite a lot higher in London, but we also see the increase in rates is also quite a lot larger in London. So the increases people put on their fees this year, quite a lot higher in London than they were elsewhere in the UK there. We also saw some small increases, so largely that the regions didn't increase, apart from London, the other regions we only see quite small increases here. But we also did see a few decreases in the east of England, and the southwest of England did actually see slight decreases in their rates from the previous year as well. So again, something to be sort of bearing in mind there. But again, once we broke down by regions, the numbers are relatively small once broken down into the various regions of the UK there. So it's one that the figures are sort of coming from maybe sort of 30, 40 respondents. So it's one of those things that will be interesting to keep looking at going forward to next year, when hopefully more people have been able to teach and report their fees, to sort of see whether any of those patterns continue or not. And the good thing, again, same with the overall sample, is that the remote teaching fees largely stayed the same as face-to-face fees across the various regions. So there wasn't anywhere particularly there where they felt they sort of had to charge less for remote work, which is a promising thing to see. And so overall, the private teaching seems to have gone relatively well for those who were able to work. Remote working seems to have been successful to some extent. So some people did report that they really enjoyed it. Others did report difficulties and so on, as we would expect. But it was still able to be done, and also charging similar fees. So only 40 people across the whole sample said that they'd reduced their rates during the lockdown, which is a great thing. And another third of the sample do say they plan to increase their fees again by the end of this year, probably as they normally would do. And then, as I did mention right at the start, they had a small but sort of significant proportion of teachers, 15%, who had seen an increase in the number of adult clients they had over this past year. So the increases were largely small, so it was only really sort of one to three extra clients that the majority of those people had seen. But it is quite, it's an interesting thing to see that, there have been those increases in adult clients. Say, maybe because of having extra time, maybe a bit of extra money. Obviously, lots of people sort of think, oh, well, during lockdown, I'm going to learn a new language. Maybe people thinking I'm going to learn an instrument. And so again, that'll be quite an interesting thing to look at going forward into next year, is whether that sort of pattern, say it's a very small pattern, whether that little trend of increase in adult learners may continue, because that would be quite a nice thing to see from lockdown. There's not been much positive coming out of lockdown, but if you see a few more adults learning an instrument, that could be a good thing. And so then from private teaching, we move on to teaching in schools. And so we look at both teachers who are employed as music teachers in schools and teachers who are self-employed visiting music teachers. And largely there wasn't that much difference seen between the two, but there are some kind of quite key differences that I'll talk through. So teachers employed in schools, the proportion had reduced, which is obviously not that surprising, because for most of the past year, schools haven't even been open. So the proportion dropped from about 30% last year of the sample down to 23%. So it's not a huge drop, but of course the fact that we have a lot less people in the survey in the first place means that it's quite a reduction in numbers there. And what was interesting to see that was the proportion teaching at independent schools, which you can see in this table here, has increased quite a lot since 2019. As state-funded schools, music hubs stays relatively similar, gone down a little bit. So it says, again, there's no way to know exactly why this might be, but it does suggest that potentially, independent schools were maybe more able to keep music lessons going, or get music lessons back up and running when that was available, and maybe they've got more money to be COVID compliant. They maybe have more space for doing distancing, maybe less pupils, so easier to do distancing and so on. But it's again, just a hypothesis, but it's kind of interesting to see that quite a large jump in people being employed in independent schools. And another thing we saw was that there was a high proportion of employed teachers working in the southeast of England. So 25 or 26% of these teachers were working in the southeast of England, as opposed to kind of pretty much around 10% across the rest of the regions of England, and then very few in Scotland and Wales. So it may be a question of, actually there's more independent schools in the southeast of England, and therefore more teachers employed in independent schools. But again, that's just a hypothesis. And it was interesting to see the very small numbers in Scotland and Wales. And obviously, I have mentioned that we had a very small sample from those regions anyway, but it sort of did get me wondering as to maybe the regulations in Scotland and Wales may have actually hampered schools getting music teachers back in, maybe even more so as well. And of course, it's very difficult this year to have known about teachers who were furloughed. So we may have a lot more employed teachers in schools still, but that haven't actually been able to work and therefore haven't answered the survey, but maybe still are employed. So it's going to be something to just keep an eye on, again, going into next year. So looking at what the numbers are looking like once things sort of slowly get back to normal. And so the hourly rates in the schools have remained kind of very similar to last year, but we had slight increases in the top rates and the bottom rates, which is great to see. We can see that rates are much higher and actually statistically significantly higher at independent schools than they are at state schools or specialist music establishments. And this is, again, the same pattern that was seen last year as well. So we can see that the specialist schools, the specialist establishments have the lowest hourly rates. And yeah, the independent schools are quite a lot higher than the average, than the median. Yeah. Sample sizes within the regions didn't allow us to do significance testing between all of the regions in a similar way as with private teaching. But we did compare London as a whole to the rest of the UK, and there was no statistical difference in rates between London and the rest of the UK. But we did see some noticeably high rates in outer London. I think if I remember off the top of my head, I seem to remember the average in outer London was around £39, I think it was. But again, smallish sample sizes. So but it was interesting to see. But one thing that might mean that London and the rest of the UK didn't show as much difference as we may expect is because there's such a large sample from the southeast within the rest of the UK, and the southeast does tend to have higher rates than other parts of the UK. So, but again, with the numbers being relatively small, only 89 teachers altogether, we didn't want to, drawing too many conclusions could be a little bit dangerous, because we don't want to be sort of drawing big conclusions from relatively small number of teachers. So for teachers that were employed in schools, we found that very few of them had received pay increases this year, which is, again, I think probably not that unexpected, because a lot may have not even really worked very much during the past year. And for those that have work's probably been less, and schools likely to have not actually had funds to be increasing pay this year. So just under a quarter have received a pay increase since last September, as opposed to around 42%, I'd say nearly half last year. So 42% had a pay rise last year. But we have had an additional 18% have said that they do expect to see their rates increase by the end of this school year, or by the start of the next school year. But it's one of those things where it's only a speculation, because when people were answering this survey, we probably weren't anticipating that the other lockdown that we then had from January until, well, really recently, and schools reopening mid-March. So some of the responses people have given about things like pay rises and so on, and how much they expect to work and how many pupils, we do have to think about the fact that actually we'd already had almost a year of lockdown when people answered this survey, but actually we then had another almost 3 months again of lockdowns in schools. So a lot of the results from schools will be very speculative, and we may see that by next year's survey there may still be impacts of a lot of the lockdowns on music teaching in schools, and they're hopefully not too much. So when it comes to like pay increases and pay rises and things, I say it's got to be cautious about those reports. We did also find that around half of the teachers who were teaching in schools, employed in schools, were able to be teaching groups and ensembles at the time of being surveyed. So that was sort of the end of last year. Again, come January, that would have all changed again with having more lockdowns. But it was good to see that by sort of November, December time, around half of those music teachers had been able to teach groups and things. And the fees for teaching groups and ensembles were very much the same as for teaching individuals. And so we didn't ask people how much they expect to work this year. We normally say how many weeks would you expect to work this year. We didn't ask that this time because it was just so, it was completely uncertain. Nobody knows. Obviously there has already been a fair few 6 months or so of schools being closed last year. Even when we came to September, schools were only just starting to reopen normally. So we didn't ask anything about that for this year. But the vast majority of teachers said that normally they work between 30 and 37 weeks of the year, employed teachers. That's pretty much most of the school year music teachers are being employed for. And so unsurprisingly, lots of teachers did report a decrease in the number of students they were teaching. And they mentioned things like having reduced hours for teaching, pupils not always wanting online lessons during the lockdown periods, some teachers choosing not to go back into school straight away because they didn't feel it was safe, others reporting that the schools didn't ask them to go back in straight away because they didn't feel it was safe, and so on. So it's all of the reasons we would expect. But it's interesting to see that the actual median number of pupils being taught remained at 25, exactly the same as last year. So although half of teachers reported that they lost students, the average, the median number is remaining kind of steady, which does suggest that some teachers are actually have managed to get more students this year, because say half of the teachers did report a decrease in the students, and half of those had lost more than 10 or more pupils. So you've sort of got this big spread of lots of teachers losing quite a lot of students, but actually some other teachers seemingly gaining more students. But because of the situation, it's hard to know if that's a trend or if that's more about maybe schools, again, rather than bringing back all of their employed music teachers, maybe only bringing back some. And so actually you've got less teachers, so they're teaching more pupils. So and again, it would be something to look at again going forward to next year to see whether that continues as well. And so, as well as teachers who are employed in schools, we asked people about doing self-employed teaching in schools, and it was a very similar proportion who said that they'd worked as self-employed, 30%. So a bit slightly up on employees, but still a relatively small proportion of the sample there. But interestingly, we see a lot more of this sample working in state-funded schools. So close to half of the self-employed teachers that don't work in state-funded schools, as opposed to independent, although as you can see, there's still quite a large proportion working in independent schools as well. Very few working in specialist music establishments, and there were a few comments only picked out at the end. There was a couple of people saying things like their music's hub that they used to work in had never reopened. Some had said that the music hub had reopened, but they'd massively reduced the number of teachers and they'd never been asked back. Obviously, that's the uncertainty of working as a self-employed person there. So that it could be that's why we're seeing such low numbers with the specialist establishments in this sample, in that they just either didn't reopen because it maybe cost them too much money to reopen, or they've only hired back a very small proportion of teachers they were hiring before. So we didn't really look any further into the specialist music establishments because the samples were just too low to look at there. But we said hourly rates again are kind of comparable with both private teaching and employed teaching. So they're around that £32 mark. So we've seen the median has risen from £32 in 2019 up to £34 there. So it's kind of more on a comparable with private teaching, which of course self-employed teaching is very similar there. And we saw that a quarter of this sample had taught remote classes at some point during the previous year, either instead of doing face-to-face teaching or as well as doing face-to-face teaching, which is a good thing to do. And so we can see that they're more likely to work at state schools than the employed teachers were. But so we also do have a large proportion at the independent schools. And again, there's various reasons why this may be, but I was thinking it may well be that obviously state-funded schools were maybe less likely to have employed staff during the pandemic. It was maybe easier to get in self-employed teachers for those periods where they were able to be open and were able to be having lessons on. And so in the same way as with employed teachers, hourly rates are significantly higher at independent schools than at state schools. And there's really quite a big difference that we see here in median rates. We can see it's almost coming up to almost £10 an hour difference between the independent schools and the state schools. I say we didn't compare in the specialist establishments because the numbers were just too small, but they did see lower rates again than the other two sets, as with the employed teachers there, which isn't surprising. But what we did see is that nearly half of these visiting self-employed teachers work in either London or the southeast of England. So it's continuing that pattern that maybe we've got more teachers in the southeast and London, where people charge more money, potentially more independent schools, sort of pushing up those rates there. So the hourly rates seen in both the southeast of England and London was statistically significantly higher than elsewhere in the UK. And again, we can see there's quite large differences there, really almost kind of the same differences we see between state-funded and independent schools, which sort of leads to a hypothesis that potentially there's a lot more self-employed teachers in London and the southeast working in independent schools as opposed to state-funded. only a hypothesis there. And so again, with rate increases, we've seen not many teachers had seen an increase in their rates for self-employed working. So it's just around 20% had an increase. So whereas we saw more than around 40% had a rate increase last year. Again, it's not obviously not that surprising. Chances are schools again don't have the money to be increasing rates this year, but also uncertainty as to how many teachers they might need to work, when they might need them to work, and so on. So we saw very few teachers receiving rate increases. And of course, it may also be with self-employed as with private teaching, that people didn't feel that they could actually ask for a rate increase because, of course, the work is very uncertain. And you're thinking, okay, well, if schools don't need as many teachers as they did before, I don't want to be the one saying I'm putting my rate up and being the one that says, okay, we don't need you. So again, it'll be interesting to continue seeing how this looks going forward into next year, whether the kind of increases that we haven't seen this year, maybe we will see maybe more increases in people's rates next year there. And those people who did receive increases, we saw that the amounts were really quite small. So the average increase was just over £1 an hour for those people who did see an increase as well there. So, and again, that's very few people seeing that anyway. And we also saw, similarly as with employed teachers, just over 60% of self-employed teachers said that they were teaching less pupils than they were before the lockdown. And this was quite a big drop, quite a much bigger drop than we saw with the employed teachers, and the average dropped from 29 pupils to 23. And there was various different reasons people gave, and a lot of this was in comments and things that people were making. So some of it was just around the kind of more obvious things, such as closures of schools. So for a long time, schools were closed, and so teaching couldn't happen. And then when people started going back into schools, some pupils just didn't take the lessons back up again. But there was also things mentioned, such as online teaching just not being appropriate for some pupils, whether it's because of fundamental things such as not having a laptop, not having good enough broadband, not having access to the instrument at home, but also for youngest pupils, just not being practical, trying to teach a lesson to a younger pupil over the internet. There was also mentionings about things like parents having less disposable income. So although I mentioned previously, one of the reasons maybe there's a few more adult clients being picked up by private teachers is maybe because some people have more disposable income because of not having anything to spend it on. Obviously, there are a lot of people who've had a lot less income this year because of just not being able to work. So that was something that a few people mentioned about parents just saying, oh, I don't want to be spending my money at the moment on private music lessons for my child because I don't have the money. And then when people started going back into schools, there was mentionings of things like just needing extra time between lessons because you have to sanitize everything. There were some things that just weren't allowed. Again, across the lockdown and across the various regions of the UK, we had different kind of rules at different times, but there was things like singing wasn't allowed at various times. Group teaching wasn't allowed sometimes, and various different instruments weren't allowed across the year as well. So I think a lot, and this goes for the private teaching, employed teaching, and self-employed. Is just really there have been so many different rules, regulations around both being face-to-face with people, and specifically around music, whether it had to be indoors or outdoors, whether singing is allowed, what kind of instruments were allowed. That really has had probably pretty big impact across all music teaching, which of course most of you there watching, I'm sure will have obviously experienced more than myself. And it's just a lot of things that are just going to be really important to sort of look at going forward into next year to kind of hopefully bring in any support needed for kind of getting people back into teaching, and hopefully seeing that teaching doesn't kind of just drop off completely because of all these restrictions that we've had. So when we compare employed to self-employed teachers within schools, we see a similar pattern to what was seen last year, is that self-employed teachers do generally on average have higher hourly rates than employees, which is the same as most careers really. Generally self-employed rates tend to be higher there. So we see it's not huge differences there, but it's sort of around, you sort of the sort of £2 to £4 mark between the bottom and top charges there, and that's the same as we saw last year as well. And actually, it's something that's just a thought that just popped into my head. Actually, is that it might be good for people who have maybe, if you have found it hard to work over this past year, or maybe you've had to stop working altogether. It's one is you may be going back into things as a self-employed teacher might be get more money. Something popped into my. And so the final thing that we asked about was sort of a little different. So rather than kind of music teaching, as us asking about any accompanying work and examining work. So it was kind of hoping that by the time that the survey would go out, we might be able to get a bit of information about this. People might have started to be able to get back into doing this kind of work, but really, even by sort of November, December, really accompanying work and examining work was not possible. It was more possible, but for most of the year, really, it's just not been possible. And of course, by the time the survey went out at the start of November, and then a day or two later, we went back into another lockdown. So all of this kind of work was just not going to be possible, or it might be sort of online, or but certainly difficult to do. So we really didn't get very much information about this year, unfortunately. So this will definitely be an area that will be quite important to look into next year to get some sort of solid figures there. So we found only 27 respondents from the whole sample had done any kind of accompanying work in the previous year. So we kind of just didn't look at that any further, because it's just not enough respondents to get any real reliable results. But we did also ask about, prior to the March lockdown, so prior to everything closing down, how many people sort of did any accompanying work there. And it was around a third of the sample had done accompanying work there, but the hourly rates did range quite a lot, from the bottom 20% charging on average £25 an hour up to the top 20% charging £40 an hour. But that's probably likely to have shown little change from last year's survey, because prior to lockdown in March was not very many months after last year's survey in September. So it's just going to be something to look into next year, and hopefully again by September this year, this kind of work will be possible again, and people will be able to kind of get back into what they were doing before. And so we also asked about streaming work online. So we're kind of wondering whether, for example, organists in church and other things like that, where that kind of accompanying work, whether people had their work maybe streamed online, or they'd maybe kind of filmed accompanying for pieces, and kind of to be either streamed or shared with people online. So there's only a very small proportion of the sample there, 12% of the sample, which was not very many people, but say it had happened that people had their work streamed online. But unfortunately, over half of these people were not actually paid for their consent to stream that work. So although it's kind of keeping people in the work theoretically, it wasn't often actually compensated for doing such, but which is a shame. Yeah. And we also asked about examining work. So again, only 23 people had done any work as an examiner over the previous year, again, unsurprisingly. So we didn't consider this data any further, but it was interesting to note that, because we asked people about working, doing exams online and things, but that didn't really seem to have been something that had happened very much. So unlike teaching online, because examinations were happening at various stages online, but we didn't seem to have very many people within the sample who'd been involved with doing any online examinations. So I say, unfortunately, this section is really, we didn't get very much data for here at all, but so it will be really important to look at that, say, going forward into next year to see if this picks back up again, which hopefully it will do. So thank you very much for listening to that, and I hope you've got any questions please ask. So the full survey and the full report is available on the ISM website. So any of the little nitty gritty, if you want to see the exact average, the average private teaching rate for the southwest of England, for example, and things like that. All of those little detailed numbers are on there as well, if you want to go into details. But as I say, just always bearing in mind that the relatively small sample that we had this year. So I think I'm going to pass over to Maria to ask me any questions that we have.
Hello, thank you very much, Alix. So that was great. We have a couple of questions. If there's anything else coming through, just please put it in the Q&A box, and we'll go ahead and ask Alix. We hope we can help. So let's start with the first one. Someone is asking if there's any data on fees for teaching a group of people together, not in schools, so privately, I'm guessing, a group of 10 adults for 2 hours a week.
Okay. So we didn't ask anything about group teaching to private teachers because, well, I mean, it hasn't been asked previously, but it's actually a very interesting one to ask about. But when we saw within schools, group teaching within schools, the fees were very much the same as hourly rates as was charged for individual teaching. So I would suggest when it comes to private teaching, I'm not an expert in this, so I wouldn't want to definitely tell you what to do, of course, but I would suggest that you'd probably be charging similar for teaching a group as you are to teaching individuals, but maybe just, slightly more, because of the fact you've got more people, but I think you'd largely be looking to charge the same sorts of rates.
Mm-hmm. I would also suggest you can ask the question in our Facebook group. There might be some other people in our in the similar situation as you, so you can see get some thoughts from other people, teachers in various areas. So we hope that helps.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's just it's been such a strange year. It's one of the things. It is almost sometimes asking other people, what did you do? Did you manage to do this? It's
Great, perfect, thank you. Now we've got a question which is in two parts, so bear with me. There's quite a lot of text. So first question is, could you tell us more about the profile of the 15% of teachers who experienced increase in adult clients? Do they tend to charge more or less than the remaining 85%?
Yes, I just saw that one. I just put that question up, thinking, it's a very long question. So no, I mean, I don't have any more detailed hand about those people, because it was such a small proportion of the survey. We didn't kind of go into it in any much more detail because it would have sort of started becoming not very anonymous. So I would imagine that it was people who were doing online teaching, because one of the things people were mentioning was that doing the online teaching meant you could reach out to more people. So, but I don't know anything more about who they are specifically or how much they were teaching. I mean, there wasn't huge variations in the hourly rates for the private teaching. So it's unlikely that we've been charging a lot more or a lot less than everybody else. But one thing, I mean, there was one specific person who did mention that they've moved house, I think they're saying, but they were saying it was great, the online teaching, because even though they'd moved, they were still reaching out to their old clients whilst building up a new client base. But yeah, so it could have been one of those. But no, we don't have any sort of detail about those 15%.
And then I think the second one is more like a suggestion which we might take in the future, but also I'll just read it out loud in case we have any recommendation. So I realised that the accompanist data is very limited, but I would still be very interested to hear more about fee structures, specifically to what extent do accompanists structure their fees as a package. For example, a single figure inclusive of travel, rehearsal time, etc., or on an itemized basis, charging for rehearsal, charging by the hour, charging for travel separately, and so on. Is there any evidence of a particular structure being more effective / popular? I'm not sure if we can assist with this.
Well, no, I mean, that's something I was thinking, because I would like to look into the Accompanists and Examiners in more detail next year anyway, because obviously we do need to kind of try and get a big sample for that. But one thing what made it even harder to really summarise for those 27 people is actually people seem to charge wildly differing rates, but also some were saying that what they charge by the hour, some were saying what they charge per person, some were saying what they charge on a daily rate. So it was really hard to summarise, because it does seem to be very just wildly differing across, and obviously with only 27 people made it quite difficult. But I am thinking that what I would like to do is actually include a few more questions about this next year to kind of ask people, do you charge per person, per hour, so we can get a bit more detail about that. Most people did seem to say that, again, very few people, but they all did say that they charge for travel in some way. Generally, anyone saying they either got get the money back for traveling, or they got paid an extra for traveling, or they added on travel fee to their fees. But it was the very wildly differing fee structures. So but I will it's good that you've asked that, because I was thinking that might be something that was good to get more detail on next year. So I will make a note of that.
The other thing I would add is also, if you have any questions regarding or any you need to find out more details. Sorry, I can't find my words. You need to find out more details. The legal team might be able to assist you with some suggestions. So you can contact them on legal@ism.org. And I can also suggest the our Facebook group, where you might get some answers from various other examiners and accompanists and see what they charge.
Yes, I think
Okay, let's see, what else do we have? Is there a variation in self-employed fees charged across levels of experience, i.e. more experience equals generally higher rates? I would say yes, I believe.
Right, well, interesting. I didn't see any huge difference. So, I didn't actually even I don't think I even put that into the full report in the end across the experience, because it actually didn't really see much difference across experience levels with rates charged. I seem to recall they were slightly higher for more experience, but there wasn't that big difference that you would have expected. But then, because such a large proportion of the sample had more than 15 years of experience, it's harder to pick out those differences, because only a very small proportion that didn't have very much experience. But no, it wasn't the difference I would expect it to see. But maybe, I don't, there might have been effects of things like lockdown and stuff like that. Maybe you might be, I'm completely hypothesizing again, but it could be that more experienced teachers sort of actually did slightly reduce their rates to keep their clients, and less experienced maybe put them up a bit because they needed more money. But no, there weren't the differences you might have expected to see.
Sure. Okay, perfect. I think we've answered almost all the questions. If there's anything else that you can think of after the end of the webinar, you can send them to us at membership@ism.org, and we can send them to Alex, or we can attempt to assist you in any way we can. So if there's nothing else coming in, which I don't think we have any more questions, I just wanted to thank Alex again for joining us today and for the presentation. Thank you all for being here with us today, for surrendering your afternoon to us. Before we leave, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have our Music Education Teach Meet seminars at the end of this month. And they are open to all teachers and school leaders, and will be an opportunity for discussion and collaboration with other ISM members and other music teachers. You can find more information at this link. Let me just put it in the chat box so you can all have it. Bear with. Sorry. There we go. So you should be able to find out more information and to register for any if any are interesting for you, or you're interested in any of them. So again, that will be all from us. Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for attending, and
thank you for having me.
We hope to see you soon. Sorry, we just had another question. Yes, the meeting will be available to view later. It should be available on our website from tomorrow, and you'll be able to find it at ism.org/webinars. So it should be on our website. But if there's any questions or you can't find it, again, just send us an email and we'll be able to forward it straight on to you. So thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon. We hope to see you at another webinar soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.